Hello, everyone, and welcome to this research seminar hosted by the British Centre for Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England, where it suddenly turned very wintry. My name is Duncan Large, and I'm the BCLT's Executive Director. You should, I think, be aware that this event is being recorded, and we'll be adding the recording to our YouTube channel shortly after the event. As ever, I'm grateful to my BCLT colleagues Anna Good and Lily Alden for their technical assistance. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, who is Henri Bloemen. Until last year, Henri was Associate Professor at the University of Leuven in Belgium and a member of the research group Translation and Intercultural Transfer. After completing his PhD on the Swiss-German writer Robert Walser in the German department at Leuven, from 1991, Henri taught German at the Katholieke Vlaamse Hogeschool in Antwerp, which later on became the Lessius Hogeschool, which in turn became part of the KU Leuven in 2013. Henri has published 2 books and 14 edited books in Dutch, numerous articles and book chapters in Dutch, German, French, and English. His research has focused on translation theory, more specifically the historical tradition in translation thought, Schleiermacher and Benjamin in particular, translation didactics, including evaluation, and the ethics of translation. Henri was a driving force behind the establishment of the Literary Translation Expertise Centre, a partnership between the Dutch Language Union, Utrecht University, and KU Leuven. He was also an organizer of the first Petra conference in 2011 and one of the partners in the Petra E project between 2014 and 16. Before I hand over to Henri, let me just say that after his talk, we'll have time for a question and answer session. We're using the Zoom webinar platform, and that allows you to submit questions via the Q&A button. So please do so. That's available throughout Henri's talk. And it enables you to vote for any other questions that you would particularly like to see answered as well. The chat is also available, and glad to see everyone saying hello from your quite far-flung places. That's great to see. Do put questions in the Q&A field by preference. So yes, I will then harvest your questions and put them to Henri at the end. For now, though, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Henri, and his talk is titled Translating Sensitive Texts and the Question of the Authenticity of Translations. A very warm welcome, Henri.
Thank you very much, Duncan, and welcome to everybody in the world. As I understood, that's nice. That's nice to hear that that translation can meet such a big interest. Okay, as you said, Duncan, already, I was interested. I'm still interested, mainly in the theory of translation and especially in the philosophy of translation. And as you said, also I'm inspired by this pre-scientific translation discourse, like the text of Benjamin of Schleiermacher and some others. You could mention Antoine Berman also, or Lawrence Venduti, or Jacques Derrida. Even so. I do this because I take a critical stand towards more or less traditional translation studies, especially the descriptive translation studies. I think that's a discipline that is operating mainly without a proper theoretical framework on translation. I was, as you said, I think also I have always been teaching literary translation and also legal translation, and I was also engaged in for 10 years from 94 until 2004 in a new translation of the Bible in Dutch. And as you know, in the Dutch-speaking area, you have the Dutch of Holland, and you have the Dutch-speaking community in Belgium, in Flanders, and they speak the same language, but there are still some differences. And I was a member of the Flemish reader panel who had to look after some Hollandisms in the translation that perhaps Flemish readers would not understand. I don't believe that. So I was some kind of a sensitivity reader avant la lettre. And when I think about sensitivity readers now, I'm very critical of it, but I'll come to that later. First of all, what I would like to say is, of course, literary texts, legal texts, Bible texts are all examples for me of so-called sensitive texts. But I come to this in a moment. I will first try to share my PowerPoint. So the concept of sensitive texts, I borrow, in fact, from this book, edited by Karl Simms, Translating Sensitive Texts, Linguistic Aspects. I think it's a reference work when we're talking about this topic of sensitivity in texts. I come to this book again in a few moments. Perhaps most of you will have heard about the discussion that emerged after the beautiful poem we could hear by the inauguration of Biden in America, of Amanda Gorman's "The Hill We Climb," and especially here in the Dutch area, but also in France and in Spain, and I think in Bulgaria, in Hungary, there were very harsh discussions about the translation of this poem. And here in the Dutch area, there was a translator appointed, and someone who is nor a man nor a woman. He or she. Well, we don't know. She or he doesn't want to be considered as a man or a woman. But she was white, rather young, and the critique was she can't translate this. She can't translate this poem written by a young Black author, a female author in the United States, and it were very harsh discussions. Also, as I said, in France and Spain, etc. And one of the consequences was, in fact, here in the Dutch area, in Dutch publishing houses, the introduction of so-called sensitivity readers. I don't know how it is in other countries, in America or in England, but we have this phenomenon of sensitivity readers now, and I must say I'm very critical of it, and that will become clear later on in my talk. Of course, I think this is or seems to be a question of translation ethics, but also that I'm not. I don't agree to that. Let me turn to this concept of sensitive text. According to Simms, institutional texts about politics, about the state, about law are sensitive texts. I think you can agree to that if you live in a multilingual country like Belgium. All legal texts have to be translated into Dutch, into French, and into German. That are the three official languages in Belgium. And these translations must be equal. Yeah, they must be. They have all power of law, and so the translation is very is a sensitive question. Of course, also sacred texts, the Bible, the Quran, and so on, are sensitive texts, and especially Simms in his very interesting introduction, he says, and I quote him, "Sacred texts present unique problems of sensitivity," and I agree to that. I can't go into the question why that is, why sacred texts present unique problems, but if you read his introduction, you will find why he says this. Also, texts about alterity of any kind, of race, of ethnicity, of cultural and sexual differences, are examples of sensitive texts. And of course, profane texts. That's the word that Simms uses, profane texts, and he means by that literary texts. I have just a point at the poetic function. So literary texts are texts with a dominating poetic function. That's the definition that Roman Jakobson gives for literary text. And yeah, he combines it with the notion of untranslatability. You know, he says, well, in a text where the poetic function is dominating, the text becomes untranslatable, and that's the case for him with, for example, poetry. I don't know if he is among the public, but I received a mail this week from Izzy Cohen with a lot of examples of other sensitive texts. Even geographical texts can be sensitive texts, and I agree to that. Or you can imagine that, for example, children's books are sensitive texts. If you are a conservative white American, you might find that an image of a cow with an udder is in some way sensitive. Okay. Philosophical texts, of course, are sensitive texts. Scientific texts are also sensitive texts, among others. Okay. Why are sensitive texts interesting for a theory of translation? I think at least because of these reasons, 4 reasons. They point at a certain relationship between original and translation, and this relationship, in a traditional sense, is hierarchical. You know, the originals are worth more than translations. Okay, if it comes to law, the original text is the masterpiece. It's the real text. It's the original. And also in sacred texts, the original text, for example, for the Bible in Hebrew or Greek, these are the law. Yeah, if a theologian wants to know what the text means, he goes to the original and not to a translation. Okay, and in the history of translation, especially in relation to the translation of Bible text and of the Quran also, quite a lot of defensive discourses have emerged. That defensive in the sense that they try to defend the original against the assault of translation. For example, in the Arabic tradition, where you see that where there is some kind of translation of the Quran is not forbidden, but it has no authority. Okay, any translation of the Quran has no authority compared to the original in Arabic. There's the principle of the so-called in Arab ijaz. Ijaz means inimitability. You can't imitate the Quran because it's already perfect. And a translation in the sense of an imitation, of a reproduction, is senseless. Okay, it can never reach the level of beauty, of perfection of the original text. Perhaps you you know all these stories that are told about the translation of the so-called Septuagint, the translation into Greek of the Old Testament, or certain books about from the Old Testament. It occurred between 300 and 250 before Christ. It's called the translation of the 70. And one of the myths says, yeah, well, the original texts were given to each of these 70 translators, and 70 days after that, they all came out with the same translation. We all know that this is improbable or impossible even. But the myth says, okay, there was some kind of a godly inspiration that inspired the translators, and they delivered all the same text. So the translation was declared equivalent to the original. Translating sensitive text has an influence on the nature of the translation process. We all want to know when something like a translation is going on, and it belongs or it is the translation of a sensitive text. We want to know what is going on during this process. Okay, what happens in translation? Is it proper? What happens there? Is it safe, etc. Of course, and we could see that in the discussions about the Gorman translation, it has an influence on the competencies a translator must have in order to be able to translate the sensitive text. Okay, in the case of Gorman, it should be someone of color. Yeah, okay. In Dutch, it became someone of color who translated it. But in the case of Bible translation, for example, you have to be, or you at least you had to be inspired by a godly inspiration. Okay. Also, these are all things that are related to the competences of a translator. Not every translator can translate a sensitive text. That's what is said. Of course, also the relation between a translation and its target audience is influenced when it comes to the translation of a sensitive text. I can refer here, for example, to the Dutch translation, the early Dutch translation of the Bible, that is known as the Staten translation. It's a Protestant translation that was made in the 17th century. And there, still in Holland, there are many people who think that this is the original. This is the only original. Okay, it's God's word in Dutch. So there is, when it comes to the translation of sensitive text, there is a special interest of the target audience. So far, as a kind of introduction to this concept of sensitive text, I come back to this in a moment. The second interesting, or the second concept I'm talking about today is authenticity. When you look at this picture, what would you think? Would you think it is an authentic Greek sculpture, or is it a forge or a forgery or a fake? Okay, when you look at it, you would say I think it's authentic. Yeah, and many specialists, it's a famous thing. Many specialists said this is authentic. This is an old Greek statue, an old Greek bronze, but in fact it is really a forge. Okay, it's not real. Yeah, it's not authentic. Or this famous painting, normally we would say, or many would say, this is painted by Hans Vermeer, the famous Dutch painter. These are the men of Emmaus. but also you will perhaps you will recognize it. It is just a painting in the style of Vermeer, yeah, by the famous forger Han van Meegeren. You know, this statue and this painting would be worth millions and millions of dollars or euros when they really were real, when they were authentic. But as forgeries, they are, this one German specialist said, well, it's worth 200 or perhaps 400 euros. It's just a material, the bronze, because it's a forge. And this one, it could be somewhat more, but not $1 million. So the question here of authenticity that is in these branches of art, of sculpture and painting, yeah, well, their authenticity is also a question of money, and perhaps also of artistic or aesthetic value, but it is expressed in this money value especially. And in analogy, I could ask, is a translation as a kind of imitation of an original worth less than an original? Okay, that's the important question for me. And in traditional translation theory, I think we have to answer, yes, a translation is worth less than an original. Okay, I don't agree to it, but in a traditional translation theory, where translation is considered as an imitation or a reproduction, or the same again, or an identical text in another language, there I think we should agree that the translation is worth less than an original. Look at libraries at your university. As Duncan said, I studied German here in German and English here in Leuven. I specialized in German, so my English is not so very good. But when I went to the library, you won't find any translation there. In the German library here in Leuven, no translation. In the English library, no translation. In the French library, no translation, etc. So they all think that when you study this kind of literature, German literature or English literature, you should read the originals and not the translation. And my question, my critical question is, does a translation have some kind of authenticity? And if so, what is it that makes a translation authentic? Okay, and I think these are very, very interesting questions when it comes to think otherwise of translation. Okay, to have a better view, to have a better image of this literary work called translation. I borrow this concept authenticity, in fact, from Walter Benjamin. He talks about it in his famous essay, The Work of Art in the Era of its Technical Reproducibility. The official English title says The Work of Art in the Era of its Technical Reproduction, but the original says Reproduzierbarkeit, so reproducibility, and that's an essential difference. I come to this in a moment again. Authenticity in English, when you look it up in the dictionary, it means original in the sense of the first. Yeah, it's what was first, and the second meaning is authentic in some kind of naturalness in the work of art or in a person or whatever. I looked it up again in my old Webster's New Collegiate Dictionary, 50 years old, and there I discovered that authentic in English, and only in English, also means conforming to the original. So an authentic translation is, in fact, a synonym for a true translation, which reproduces the features of the original. I think in Dutch and in German, the concept doesn't have this meaning. In German, the term Echtheit means also real. Something is when you call something echt, it is real, it exists, it has an existence. And the second meaning is also that of original, but only as a second meaning. Benjamin defines authenticity or Echtheit in German as das Hier und Jetzt des Kunstwerks, sein einmaliges Dasein an dem Orte, an dem es sich befindet. So the here and now of a work of art, its unique existence at its proper place. That's Echtheit. Okay, it's the only work of art in its uniqueness. Okay, it's the Mona Lisa there in Paris. Okay, and nothing else. A second thing that Benjamin says, and that may interest us when we talk about translation, he says, der gesamte Bereich der Echtheit entzieht sich der technischen Reproduzierbarkeit. So the authenticity cannot be reproduced technically, Benjamin says. Okay, this might be interesting, especially in our days of automatic translation or computer-aided translation or translations made by artificial intelligence, which are all examples of technical reproduction, I think. But this is very important for me now. So what the authentic aspect of a work of art, its realness, its actuality, its being here and now, it can't be reproduced. That's something to remember. Okay. I come back to sensitivity and to Karl Simms. When you read his book, there are some 20 contributions, I think. Nearly all contributions, at least 19, and except perhaps the introduction also, nearly all contributions in Simms treat sensitivity as a mode of reception or as a subjective reaction to a text. And I quote him, the degree of sensitivity lies in the text's ability to trigger connotative meaning. And he goes on, living in the world as one of the animals who speak depends far more on the connotations of words than on their denotations. And it is precisely in this respect that language and therefore text is sensitive. Well, according to this, you could say that everything you say, every time you use language, you are producing something sensitive. Perhaps he's right, okay? But let's stick for a moment to this difference between denotation and connotation. Connotation in the sense of the subjective, secondary subjective meaning of language, of words, of phrases, of texts. He says, Simms, in his introduction, these are all quotes from his introduction, no text is sensitive, but that thinking makes it so. However, such thinking is intrinsic to language, and then, very important, as experienced by humans. So that we may say that all texts are at least potentially sensitive. Okay. So again, language as experienced by humans. Let's remember this. Okay. Texts able to provoke sensitive reactions by a reading public, and Simms calls in Simms it is called receptor response, are considered as sensitive. Okay, even a text that may be not sensitive is sensitive when it provokes sensitive reactions in the public. So sensitivity, according to Simms, is a characteristic of a human public or of human subjects, and not of a text. And that's important. The text only triggers sensitive reactions in a public. Okay, that's the situation. So sensitivity, considered as a mode of reception, these are consequences. Sensitivity, considered as a mode of reception, leads to a strong tendency to control the public's reaction. I think you can imagine that, okay? When something is sensitive and the text becomes translated, yes, the control is very strong, or the tendency to control the translation, to have power over the translation, is very strong. Translations and sensitivity are closely related because, and of course, translation is a massive intervention in the text. Okay, everything is changed in translation. Every letter is changed. You have the double bind of different translation of the traditional translation norm based on equivalence and identity that says be the same but be different. So that's the impossible task of the translation in a traditional sense. You have to be the same, but you have to be different. That's quite impossible. That's a classic double bind. The discussion about sensitivity seems to be about political or cultural or ethnical or ethical correctness. But at the end, I think it is a question of power and of control. And therefore, it seems that the translation of sensitive texts seems to be an ethical issue. And there's a lot of things said about translation ethics in the last 10, 20 years. I have a stand in this. I have a thesis, and I don't know whether you agree or not, but this is my point of view as it comes to ethics. In a situation in which someone or some instance tells you what to do and how to decide, you've left the ethical field. You're no longer in the ethical field. It's no longer an ethical question. If someone tells you you should decide, you should translate this in this way, there's no ethical problem anymore. When a decision is an application of clear norms, it is not ethical. Okay. An ethical decision, or we can talk about ethics in a situation in which you don't know what to do, and yet you have to decide. And I think many translators will agree that this is a situation they know all too well. Can we think about sensitivity otherwise? So we said sensitivity is, in fact, a characteristic of the public, of a public reacting to a text. Can we think of another notion of sensitive text? And that would be a text that would be sensitive as a text that would be sensitive because it has the essential feature sensitivity. Okay? That's the question there is, can objects be sensitive? Okay? Can a non-living object, a table or a clock or a pen, can it be sensitive? Or a text as an object? Normally, I think, and when you look at the analysis of the meaning of words, sensitivity is considered as a relational concept, and a relational concept, linguistically seen, requires a subject that is plus animate, that is plus living. For example, love is a relational concept, and in the semantic analysis of the concept of love, you would meet the feature plus animate, or perhaps plus human. But when I looked up the word sensitivity or sensitive in my Webster, there you'll find that sensitivity means the quality or state of being receptive to sense impressions. Of course, this word sense means, again, that you have to be plus animate. You know, it's about feeling. It's about, what you feel with your senses. But Webster also says capability of being stimulated or excited by external agents. And that's a very interesting definition. And I really think that you can talk about sensitive things. Think about a sensor, a photographic sensor in a digital camera. You can easily call it sensitive, okay? Or think about a simple thermometer, it is sensitive. Or think about the scale in your kitchen. Some scales are more sensitive than others. So I think objects can really be sensitive, and also texts considered as objects can be sensitive. I come, and this is the core of my talk, which is in essence Benjaminian. Yeah, okay, I refer to Walter Benjamin, the translator's task. Benjamin has a very interesting concept of translatability, and it is related to this concept of sensitivity. In his famous text that appeared exactly 100 years ago in October 1923, so it's 1 century old. He says, and these are very important quotes, "It must be pointed out that certain concepts gain their proper, indeed, I have to move away these. Okay, it must be pointed out that certain relational concepts, such as love, for example, gain their proper, indeed, their best sense when they are not, from the outset, connected exclusively with human beings. Thus, he says, we could speak of an unforgettable life or moment, even if all human beings had forgotten it. To forget or to remember are also relational concepts. And then he says, and this is stunning, if the essence of such lives or moments required that they not be forgotten, this predicate would not be false. It would merely be a demand to which human beings had failed to respond. So an unforgettable life or moment is unforgettable because it is unforgettable in itself and not because somebody recalls it or doesn't forget it. In analogy, Benjamin defines the concept of translatability in a new way, and that is completely different from what we think about the problem of translatability. The question of a work's translatability, Benjamin says, has two senses. It can mean, will it ever find among the totality of its readers the adequate translator? That's our meaning of translatability. And Benjamin rejects it. Or, he says, more pertinently, whether by its very essence, it allows itself to be translated and hence also calls for translation. So a translatable text allows itself to be translated and it calls for translation. This is really an exclusion of the subjective factor in translatability and in translation, and it is completely objective. It's a complete objectivation of the concept of translation and translatability. It is a question of the text itself and the longing of the text for translation. That's completely different of what we think about translatability. When a publisher wants to translate a book, he looks for a translator who could do that. Okay, that's the normal thing for us. But I mean, in theory, Benjamin tries to think of translatability in a more objective sense of the word. So translatability is the text's allowance of and its call for translation. Of course, the question is, how can we hear this call? How can we experience the call for translation by a text? How can we respond to this allowance of the text to be translated? That's difficult. Okay, I don't know how. I cite Benjamin again. I quote him again. Translation is properly essential to certain works. This does not mean that their translation is essential for themselves, and then he says, but rather that a specific significance inherent in the original text expresses itself in their translatability. So the translatability is a property of the text itself, and not of and it does not depend from of the capacity of a translation of a translator. Okay. So Benjamin proposes a concept of text that is open for and even longs for translation, and thus for change and development. And this is the most quoted sentence in his whole text. In translation, Benjamin says, the original's life achieves its constantly renewed, latest, and most comprehensive unfolding. I think we should look at this sentence attentively. He says, the original's life, the life of the original itself, achieves its constantly renewed, latest, and most comprehensive unfolding. So translations are a part of the original's life. I hope you see that here the question of sensitivity, of translatability, and of authenticity come together in this senses. The last quote from Benjamin. Far from being a sterile similarity between two languages, that's the traditional concept of translation, that have died out, translation is, of all modes, precisely the one called upon and then to mark the after-ripening of the alien word and the birth pangs of its own. So what does a translation do? A translation marks the change in, or the changes in language, in the original as well as in its own one. So a translator is someone who marks the dynamic of language. Benjamin calls it the after ripening of the alien word. So the after ripening of the word of the original and the birth pangs of the target language, of the language of the translator. So these are both two dynamic factors that change constantly, and the translator is the one who marks these differences and this dynamic and acts according to it. Okay, so a text is not at the disposal of a translator. A translator has to hear. In German, the word for mark is merken. Yeah, he has to hear, he has to feel what is going on in the text and what is going on in the proper language, in the target language. And with these dynamic factors, a translator has to work. So, translatable texts are texts that are able to be touched by translation. It belongs to their essence. Yes, there's translatability belongs to the essence of the original text. Okay? Translations renew the original in another language. So the original lives on in another language. Translations, thus, are part of the original's afterlife, and translations mark the dynamic that constantly changes language. Okay? This leads us to a completely other concept of translation, I think. Let's recapitulate. So sensitive texts are texts which are sensitive as objects, as texts, not because they are considered as sensitive, not because they trigger sensitive reactions, but in themselves, they are sensitive. Think of poems, think of rhyme in the poem, think of words that are repeated in the text, etc. Think about the poetic function of Jacobson. These are all examples of sensitivity as a feature of the text itself. Sensitivity is not a mode of reception by a target audience. So I'm very critical of this concept of sensitivity as it is exposed in the book by Karl Simms, which is very interesting. I would recommend to read it if you are interested in this question. A sensitive text is a text able to receive external impulses. Nothing else is translatability. Translatability, a translatable text, is a text that is able to receive impulses from the outside. So translatability is a feature of a text. It does not depend on the capacity of a translator. A text is not translatable if some translator can translate it. That's something else. A translatable text allows translation and calls for it. That's the most difficult aspect. I don't know how you can, as I said already, I don't know how you can hear this call of a text. Okay. To my students, I always said, well, when you read a book, sometimes a novel or a short story, sometimes you could have the reaction, this book must be filmed. This book must be translated into a film. So therefore, because you don't know really why, but when reading it, you see the film already before your eyes. So there's some call of the text itself for being filmed. And I think there must be something analogous when you read a text as a translator, that you want to hear, that you see this text, you could add something to it. You could give him another life when it comes to translation. Translations unfold the life of the original, and they constantly renew it. Okay? So translation has a responsibility vis-a-vis the life of the original. Okay? It's a responsible task. It is not just a service for readers who don't understand the original language. It goes much more deeper into the life of the text itself. Okay? All this, of course, is a discussion with the traditional concept of translation, which is rejected by Benjamin, and I follow him in that. In the traditional concept of translation, translations are secondary vis-a-vis the original. The original comes first, and the translation comes afterwards, and it is secondary in importance. A translation is just a similar reproduction, or it should be. That's still a norm that you can hear as translation. I reject this. The original is a unique text, and translations are many. Okay? Also, that influences the image of translations. An original is strong, and a translation is weak. Therefore, also in the feministic translation theory, originals are male and translations are female, or considered as. Translations alter, and they are every translation is different, even in the same language. Retranslations are different from previous translations. The original is stable. We think so of that. I don't agree, and Benjamin says they both change. There is an after ripening of the fixed words, and the language of the target language changes also. So these are two ever-changing factors. There's nothing of stability in it. And in the traditional concept of translations, a translation is a service for readers who don't understand the original. Okay? Can we rethink translation in order to quote Lawrence Venuti? I think indeed, if we look at this concept of the afterlife of original texts, it should be considered as change, as development, and newness, or as alterity. So this classical double bind, be the same but be different, yeah, it doesn't work. Okay, and we should accept that that translations are in essence different texts, but they continue the life of the original. Okay, translations are part of the original's life. They are intimately connected to the life of the original, and therefore they participate in the authenticity of the original. Okay? I think there is, at least because of this concept of afterlife, translations have at least an aspect of authenticity. Okay? You could ask, okay, again, in this context of authenticity, is the translation of a work of art itself a work of art? I say yes. Okay, because of this connection with the life of the original. Okay? The translations are intimately connected to the original's life, and therefore they participate in its being a work of art. Translations are works of art, not because they are made so similarly, but because they are part of the afterlife of the work of art. what makes a translation then authentic? As a reproduction, a translation cannot reproduce the authenticity of a work of art. So as long as we consider translation as a reproduction or an imitation, how true it may be, it will never gain some authenticity. Okay, that's what the history of translation makes clear, very clear. Just as translation is a distinctive mode, Benjamin says, the translator's task may also be conceived as distinctive and clearly differentiated from the poet's. Okay, so you have the poet and you have the translator. Okay, what the translator does is to hear, to mark, to feel the call for translation by the originals, by the original text. It's an answer to the longing of the text for translation. My big question is, and I don't have an answer to it, how can we experience this call? How can we just know what this allowance for translation, what this means? But every translation that does this is a work of art. A translation is a witness of the dynamics inherent in language. And therefore, as a translator, and this consider this as a very practical consequence of what I'm saying. As a translator, il faut être absolument moderne, as Rimbaud says, in matters of language. Okay, you have to be at the edge of language change as a translator. You owe it to the original. Okay, as a translator, you are responsible for the afterlife of the original, and therefore you have to be at the edge of language change. You have to hear the changes in language and applicate them in the translation. Okay. So to come to an end, and we can discuss then afterwards, a translation that is an answer to the text call for translation participates in the text authenticity. This is my thesis. Therefore, translations can be authentic, they can be real, they have some kind of Echtheit. The task of the translator is an ethical one, as long as the translator is prepared to answer the original's longing for translation, which means is to find an answer to the text demand for translation. You are not acting ethical when you listen to sensitivity readers. Obeying to ethical standards is quite easy, and in fact, it has nothing to do with an ethical attitude. The ethical game is on when you don't know what to do. I thank you very much.
Henri, thank you. What a wonderfully rich presentation, and thank you for giving Benjamin such pride of place in his not just the centenary year, but almost the centenary month of his classic essay. The questions have started to come in. So can I invite our audience to please ask your questions in the Q&A field, and I will put them to Henri on your behalf. I wonder, Henri, if I could, though, start off by just asking you to sort of to clarify the strength of your claim here, because you said on one of your slides quite sort of categorically that sensitivity is not a mode of reception by a target audience, and so I suppose I'm just wondering, does it have to be an either or? You're suggesting an entirely different model, and therefore the kind of sort of sensitivity talk which you were responding to in the earlier that earlier collection, is should they simply be using a different term, or is it possible that perhaps sensitivity could cover both, so that it's not just an either or? I'm just wondering whether, if the text, if sensitivity, I love that argument that you present by analogy with Benjamin on translatability, that sensitivity then is a feature of the text. Can it not also be a feature of a response to the text, or would you want to argue that no, that we need a different term for that or something?
I think you can think it together, but because a sensitive text may just as well really trigger sensitive reactions. For example, a beautiful text, a text that is sensitive because of its beauty, because there is a beautiful rhyme, a beautiful rhythm in it, where the poetic function really functions ideally, it can trigger the sensitive reaction of beauty in what you experience as beauty. So I don't exclude this, but to understand what I don't know how you can objectivize this, because when we take this poem that is a perfect poem by Keats, for example, well, someone will say, well, I don't like it. You will say, but this is a perfect poem. So you can't objectivize it. So in this sense, I have some scientific, ambition, but that doesn't go very far. Why not consider sensitivity as an objective feature, as a feature of an object, and not of this very volatile human reactions to sensitivity? Well, there are some sensitive reactions may end up in terrorist acts. You see that. So there is an enjeu with this sensitivity. You're right. Okay, you can't deny it, but you can't objectivize it. Someone will say, well, it's just a translation failure, but the terrorist will say, I'll kill you. Okay, for that.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Perhaps we can take one of a first question from our audience, because a number have been coming in, which is great. A question from Raoul Colon in Ottawa. And Raoul asks, is sensitivity an enriching or an impoverishing or both feature of the original text? And can translation diminish or increase or both that sensitivity? If these questions seem paradoxical, it is because they are, says Raoul. So enriching or impoverishing, is sensitivity enriching or impoverishing feature of the original text? And can translation diminish or increase it?
I would say in any way it is enriching, because even in a subjective way, a sensitive text, a text that speaks to you and you can hear it, you can experience this sensitivity, it is an enriching for yourself, I think. Because otherwise, a text that is not sensitive, it won't reach you. You won't. There's no call coming from the text towards you. So this is again perhaps a subjective aspect of sensitivity. But the first thing is in the text itself. The first condition for sensitivity is the sensitivity of the text itself. And the second is the subjective reaction to it. Okay, so it is. I would say yes, it is enriching. Okay, and I don't know whether this phrase of enriching is useful for translation. You often hear it in translation critique. That a translation is poorer or richer than the original. I really don't have a measurement for that. I don't know, but a translation that that is the result of an answer to the original's call for translation is certainly enriching in the fact that it really that by doing that the translation becomes a part of the life of the original. It is this intimate. Benjamin calls it an intimate connection, between the original and the translation.
Thank you. A question from Tiffany Levick. Tiffany asks, who then, in your opinion, should translate sensitive texts, especially if these texts present the voices of marginalized communities? And how might we ensure a sensitive approach to the translation of sensitive texts so that the people translating them are equipped with the relevant knowledge and experience to interpret and reproduce the specificity of the texts?
There's no insurance. For me, there's no insurance that this will happen. You take the example of the Dutch translation of Amanda Gorman. It was translated. It was translated 2 times. It was translated by the first translator or translatress. I don't know how to call it. And afterwards, it was translated again by someone of color, by a black translator, a woman. But this translation was considered as very normal, as not. The people in Holland prefer to read the original. So that's the consequence then. And this was really, the discussion was really about this person, that was foreseen by the publisher. She or he, I don't know, she can't do it. And you must be of a black color to do it. Okay? So I think it's not about the person of the translator. It's about this hearing the call. And I don't know whether it's a woman or someone of color or a man. In fact, it doesn't matter, I think. And I agree that you have to listen also to the circumstance, or that you have to see the circumstances in which a translation takes place. And when it is about minorities, etc., you should be attentive to it. But I think hearing the text sensitivity is something else. And I think that conditions that are made in these discussions, for example, this is about Gorman and others, really are not very fruitful, I think, and they are ethical in not a very nice sense of the words. Ethical means power. Ethical means that there is someone who knows what to do and who knows how to decide, and who will say, no, you can't use this word, you must use another word because this could trigger sensitive reactions in the public. But that's not the question that translators should ask themselves. There's this freedom of a translator towards the text, and this freedom is really an empty space. There should be no instance who is there and tells you what to do. That's ethical. Even if you don't know what to do, you can listen to the sensitivity reader, and you can, okay, perhaps this or that, but not as a first reaction. The first reaction is to cope with this uncertainty. Yeah, okay, that is ethical to me. Okay, to act when you don't know what to do. That's the difficulty. And I think that's typical for translators. When I translate myself, I very, very often don't know what to do. I don't know which word would I put there. Which word is really, what would I write there? And I think that's then the ethic game is on. Okay. I don't know whether I answered the question.
So your for you then the primary ethical responsibility of the translator is towards the text, towards answering the call of the text.
Of course, yes.
Thank you.
No doubt about that for me.
Thank you. Let's take a question. Actually, we've got one or two practical questions about particular translation situations. A question from an anonymous attendee. One of my clients is a small religious group, so I'm involved in what I call liturgical translation, and this clearly comes under the umbrella of sensitive texts. My biggest challenge is that when I translate primarily to convey the meaning and intention of the source text, Chinese, the client frequently pushes back against my choices, preferring a more literal, direct translation at the expense of idiomaticity. Would you recommend that I stick to my guns and convey the intended meaning, perhaps providing justification for my choices?
Who am I to decide? Because in my view, the confrontation should be really between the call of the original and your work as a translator. And who am I to decide? And who is this man or woman who ask for a more literal or free translation? That's if they want that, give it. But I would make another translation afterwards and tell them this is the better one, or I think this is the better one. So that's difficult. That's well. Then you are in this logic of translation as a service. Should a translation be some kind of a service to a public that asks for a certain translation? And that's yeah. Well, I try to think of translation otherwise, not as a service, but as a dialogue between those two texts.
A question now from Anna Wright about this question of answering a call. I'm absolutely fascinated by this reading of Benjamin that you're giving us, and for me it suggests a kind of de-essentialization of the ideal translator for a sensitive text. If it's any translator effectively who can answer that call. Anna Wright asks, although not about equivalence, might your concept of sensitive translation be viewed as an act of homage to or veneration for the original, if it is the hearing and answering of a call? Is it not a slightly exclusive, even submissive view, or is it empowering?
No.
Are only certain select or specially gifted individuals able to hear and answer that call, or is the act open to all who take up the call?
I think it's open. It's the last one. It's certainly, and I don't. Well, it's not this reaction to the text sensitivity doesn't or should not end up in a slavery imitation of the original. It is the change. It's the right to change the text according to this dynamic in language. So yeah, il faut être absolument moderne. So and that means that you have to change and not venerate the original, and not so much admire it and be okay. This is the holy original. No, it's for Benjamin. It was quite obvious that the translation is really a radical change of the. It is a radical change. It is radically different, and it is intimately related. These are the two. So it is different, and you have the right to be different. You must be different, in fact, and by being different, you renew the original's life. prolong the original slide.
Thank you. A question from Jill Holmes about this idea of the call of the text as well. Jill says, your argument is persuasive and coherent, but in my opinion, there's a weakness in the idea of the essence of a text calling out for translation, given our inherent inability to gauge this with any certainty. It would seem to render the idea invalid. How would you respond? So how do we gauge this this call?
Yeah. That's my question too. In many cases, I think you have this. I don't know. I speak for myself. When I read certain texts, they occupy me. They really take possession of me, and then I often started translating them, as I gave it up most of the times, but there was this tendency in myself, this compulsion, I would say, to answer the text by translating it, and in fact that was a pleasure for me to do, because I had a feeling then to not only to understand the text better, but to do something with the text, and to give it the opportunity not only to live as an object that can be read, but that to translate is something else than reading. It's making a new text. It's making another text of a text that you admire, or where you can feel that there is a connection between you and the text. I don't know. I mean, I don't have this experience very often, but there are quite some texts that take possession of me as a reader, and I'm really, you have this reading impulse. You read all night and days after. Well, these are good signs. These are really these are fruitful moments for perhaps to hear this call for translation, even when these texts are very, very different. I had this experience, for example, with some texts of Heinrich von Kleist in German. And these texts are so different and so difficult also for me to translate into Dutch, even when German and Dutch are very similar languages. You come to another text, and the text tells you something else than the original, but it is generated by the admiration or this compulsion that the text that takes you in. Well, I don't know how to express it in English, but
I really liked your analogy with reading a text and having the thought, oh, this deserves to be filmed. The idea then, this deserves to be translated. Yes. Yes.
You can imagine then what it means, that is called.
We've a question from Francis Jones, who was with us as a panelist 2 weeks ago when we were launching Helen Gibson's book. Francis asks, I agree that some texts might be sensitive per se, but in most sensitive cases, isn't it the communicative situation of translation which is sensitive? And Francis gives the example, the editor of a UK anthology of Bosnian poetry once asked me to translate a poem by warlord Radovan Karadzic, poet and Serb rebel leader in the 1990s war against Bosnia, to find out what sort of poet could order the firebombing of libraries. The source poem, written in the 1970s, was uncontroversial, run-of-the-mill, so non-sensitive, but my translation, or rather the translating situation, was sensitive, in my view. I certainly felt I had to translate very carefully.
Yeah. In fact, I agree. Yes, especially in the case of these political of political sensitivity. I could agree. But still then, I think that this sensitivity must have an effect in the text itself. And it not only depends, and even not in first instance, it doesn't depend on the circumstances, but it depends on the text itself, and secondly, on the circumstances in which translation takes place. But yeah, I understand what Francis means.
There's a question from Mary McGovern. I think I don't have good enough Dutch to be able to judge this, but Mary asks, what would you do if you were translating a text from the 1930s that uses words like, I think this is the N word in Dutch, that were acceptable when written but are regarded as insensitive today?
I think the answer must be change it, and find words that comply to this change in language itself. It's no use using words that nobody understands, or that well, I can't say that, in fact, that don't have the same effect or effect of rejection or of admiration or something like that. So I would say change it. Okay.
Thank you. An interesting question from Abdel Karim Shturu, who asks, will text sensitivity spare them from the artificial intelligence treatment? It's a very spare question, but I think we can see it's
a very important question.
It's a very important one.
Yeah. And I've been giving some thoughts on this, a very important question, I think. According to Benjamin, this dynamic in language goes towards some point in the future that we don't know. This is some of the messianic aspects in this text, but I take it literally. So there is a process, and it is prospective. It is radically prospective. You don't look back, you go into the future. It is the life that's going on. Yeah, it's the afterlife of text, which means it goes towards a future. And also this dynamic in language is something prospective. It is a very autonomous movement in language that we as language users can't influence. It influences us, but we don't influence it. That's again a radical change in the thoughts about language. But given this fact that the dynamic of language is principally prospective and going towards a future point, then I would say artificial intelligence is of no danger to translators, because they only are radically retrospective. Artificial intelligence works with the archive. Artificial intelligence can never be absolument moderne. It is always looking back. It's always working with what was there and not what will be there, and even not what is there. It is always looking back to what is in the archive. Okay, artificial intelligence works with the known, not with the new, with new things. And in art, I think, especially in art that matters, we are confronted with the new things. Artificial intelligence is, again, it is retrospective. It just is active in the archive and not in this dynamic towards the future. So I'm not afraid of artificial intelligence in this respect. When it comes to translation and to translations that matter, artificial intelligence systems will never produce translations that are absolument whatever. Never. They can't. They just can't. They're not. They can't possibly do so because they're always looking backwards and not to the future.
Thank you, Henri. Great answer. A question from, I'm just aware of time here. We are running a little short on time, but we can certainly take this question from Hamouda Salhi, who says, thank you, Professor Bloemen, for the illuminating presentation that has prompted a profound exploration into the intricate nexus of text, sensitivity, authenticity, translatability, and the dynamics inherent in the translation process. I'd like to pose the following question, seeking to interconnect these facets with the concept of creativity. To what extent can one discern a correlation between the innate sensitivity of a text and its level of creativity, particularly when contemplating texts of diminished creative substance? Can texts characterized by lesser degrees of creativity evoke responses of comparable sensitivity? Let's perhaps, that's already, I think, plenty to go on.
Yeah. I haven't thought much about it, but I think there is really a connection between sensitivity and creativity. I think creativity is really, when we're talking about reactions to a text, I would say being creative is the best reaction you can have towards the sensitivity of the text. Okay, being creative means that you see that you feel the even the minor differences, the minor features of a text. You just mark this word that Benjamin uses, the translator as a marker, who marks the differences, who marks what is going on in the text and what is going on in language. I think both might end up in being a creative translator. So I really think that creativity and sensitivity are interlinked. But I can't go. I haven't spent much thoughts on creativity yet, because it has always been seen as some kind of a subjective feature of a translator. But I think there is also some objectivity in this concept of creativity as a response, as an authentic response to the text sensitivity and translatability.
Thank you. I think we can perhaps take a last question. I'm going to run two questions together because they're both asking about your views on other translation theorists and cultural theorists who you haven't mentioned so far. PTF asks, would you consider the part of your talk on the survival of the source text through the target texts Barthesian in any way? And Anna Wright asks, where does the concept of sensitive texts living on or newly expressed in translation fit with or follow Lefebvre's idea of translation as rewriting, either for the good or worse? So Barthes and André Lefebvre.
Yeah. I don't know Barthes well enough to give an answer to the question, I must admit. But I can imagine, yes, that it is in some way in Barthes' sense. But for Barthes, the reader was really the central point in the whole process of reception of literature. I think Benjamin, and I follow him, or I try to follow him. For him, the major point is really language itself, and not the one who uses language. Okay, So I think Barth, for Benjamin, Barth may be too subjective in a well, in not so good sense of the word, subjective. I don't know. And Lefebvre, well, it's I don't know. I think Lefebvre has a rather determinate vision of a translator. A translator is someone who is determined fully by the circumstances he or she works in. I remember his critique of a German translation of Niels Holgersson, which in the time of in the Nazi time, and there he is very harsh and said, "Well, this is you see the translators work in a certain time in certain circumstances, and therefore they use such words that are required by the Nazi ideology." That's for me, okay, when a translator does this, it's a bad translator. He or she listens to what others say, the party or the publisher or whoever means that he is an ethical instance or a political instance that tells you what to do. So you really have, I think, this complete and autonomous freedom as that you also have as a reader. You read this text and there's something is coming up and nobody else tells you how to understand it. It's what the text tells you, and I think a translator has this in a much more eminent sense of the word, because he or she has to do something with it in a new text, in another text, and that's the only responsibility he or she has, not towards some instance, and that's what Lefebvre is constantly doing, I think. So I'm not very. I don't agree with him.
Henri, I think we need to wrap up. The time has flown by, but thank you so much for such a wonderfully rich and thought-provoking presentation. Thank you to our audience for your excellent questions, which Henri has answered so generously. Just a word to our audience about our next event, which is in fact going to be, unusually for us, a hybrid event, which is in Norwich and online in a week's time. We're going to be hosting Alexander Bubb, who will be speaking on Victorian world literature, Asian classics translated for the popular audience. That will be in a week's time, an hour later than our usual slot, starting at 5 p.m. here in the UK. But that's for next week. For now, Henri, thank you so much once again. And again, thank you to our audience.
Thank you very much, Duncan, for the invitation. It was a pleasure for me. And bye to everyone.